Right, let's dive straight into today's explainer. We're going to be unpacking the incredibly thick, totally distorted reality of the human ego. Specifically, we are answering one of the most deeply frustrating questions out there. Why in the world are the people who know the least so often the loudest? We see it literally every single day, right? Online, at work, at the Thanksgiving table, and it's a completely fascinating, if not totally maddening quirk of human psychology.
I mean, really think about this for a second. Have you ever found yourself in an argument with someone who has absolutely zero expertise, no evidence whatsoever, and zero logical backing, and yet they're speaking with this absolute, unshakable authority? You're probably just standing there banging your head against an invisible wall thinking, how on earth can someone so incredibly ignorant be so utterly sure of themselves? It's just a universal frustration. Most of us immediately point to the Dunning-Kruger Effect. You know, that idea that incompetence literally blindfolds people to their own incompetence. But there's actually a much deeper history to this.
Now, you might be thinking this is just some modern social media disease, right? Actually, scratch that. It's not new at all. The philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer documented this exact psychological mechanism of intellectual blindness centuries ago. He watched it happen in elite universities, in high society social circles, and in the halls of power. He watched mediocre minds speak with absolute authority, and he figured out not just that they do it, but structurally why they literally cannot help doing it.
Let's move to part 1, the fool's paradise, ignorance disguised as certainty.
So Schopenhauer figured out something brilliant. To even see how complex his subject is, you actually have to be smart enough to recognize that complexity. And recognizing complexity requires actual knowledge. If you're too ignorant to see all the moving parts, well, everything just looks remarkably simple. And if everything looks simple to you, you feel completely certain. Think about when you learn a totally new skill. As a beginner, you watch an expert and think, hey, that doesn't look too hard. It's only when you actually step up, try it, and fail spectacularly that you realize the massive gaping chasm between your skill level and true expertise. That, oh wow, this is hard realization, that's the actual beginning of competence. But the wildly confident people we're talking about never have that moment. They lack the depth to see the structural complexity beneath the surface, which just traps them in this illusion that everything is incredibly easy.
It basically boils down to this. The less you know, the more confident you become. Why? Because certainty is literally the language of ignorance, while nuance is the language of understanding. Anyone who actually gets a complex topic knows for a fact that nothing worth understanding is perfectly simple. If you ask a real expert a question, they're almost always going to start with, well, you know, it depends. But a fool gives you a loud, confident, hyper-simple answer with absolutely zero caveats.
Moving on to part 2, familiarity versus true expertise, the illusion of comprehension.
This perfectly describes our modern social media landscape. You have definitely seen this exact pattern. Someone doom scrolls a few articles, watches a couple of quick videos, and suddenly, boom, they are speaking with the confidence of a tenured professor. They completely confuse passive familiarity with active expertise. Familiarity just means you've been exposed to an idea. Big deal. Expertise means you can actually work with those ideas. You can apply them to novel situations, and most importantly, you know their limits. Like someone reads a few Stoic quotes on Instagram and suddenly they're handing out major life advice. But if you were to ask them about the actual structural mechanics of Stoic ethics, you're just going to get a blank stare. They're familiar, sure, but they totally mistake that surface-level familiarity for genuine understanding. Marcus Aurelius really hit the nail on the head here. This captures the exact danger we're talking about. Ignorant people hear an opinion and they genuinely think they've just acquired a hard fact. They see a single perspective and believe they've somehow grasped the absolute, undeniable truth. They are completely and utterly unable to distinguish between passing exposure to a concept and genuine, rigorous understanding.
Which brings us to part 3, the blindness of incompetence, the competence threshold.
Here is a really brutal reality check that Schopenhauer identified. To recognize that someone else is excellent at something, you actually have to be somewhat competent at it yourself. Think about a little kid watching a chess grandmaster. They just see little wooden pieces sliding across a board. They can't appreciate the sheer genius of the strategy because they haven't crossed what's called the competence threshold. If you are truly deeply incompetent, a world-class genius and a mediocre amateur look exactly the same to you.
And because of that blindness, you get this massive, almost comical disconnect in self-awareness. People who lack specific knowledge genuinely believe their poorly structured, surface-level work is just as good as the seasoned experts. And it's not because they're necessarily arrogant. It's because the deep structures, the nuanced arguments, the underlying logical frameworks of the experts' work are completely invisible to them. When they submit terrible work and feel super proud of it, It's a literal structural blindness. They physically cannot perceive the massive gap between themselves and reality.
All right, part 4. Complexity as a disguise, camouflaging the ignorance. Now, it's important to realize that not all ignorance is just loud and obvious. Sometimes it's dressed up. Complicated stupidity actually fools a lot of smart people. Simple stupidity is easy to spot. But if someone starts dropping massive buzzwords, think of that guy in a corporate meeting talking about synergizing cross-functional paradigm shifts. Audiences will often assume that person is a total genius, just because they sound complicated. People naturally assume that if something is incredibly hard to understand, it must be profound.
Schopenhauer was absolutely ruthless about these pseudo-intellectuals. They endlessly consume complex ideas, but they never actually digest them into true workable understanding. They just regurgitate the complexity. As Marcus Aurelius pointed out, if you can't explain something in simple terms, you don't actually understand it. But these guys, they invert that completely. They think if they can't explain it simply, it must mean their ideas are just way too sophisticated for the average mind. It's an elaborate performance of intelligence, not the real thing.
Let's head into part 5, the closed loop, the immunity to correction.
Let's walk through this incredibly frustrating cycle together. Picture this impenetrable fortress of confident ignorance. You try to correct someone, right? You bring hard data, and they immediately question your source. You use basic logic, and they tell you you're just overcomplicating things. It fails every single time because they literally lack the mental receiver for your evidence. It's exactly like trying to send a fax to someone who doesn't own a fax machine. The transmission on your end is perfect, but they literally don't have the equipment to receive it. Because they lack the mental framework to process contradictory evidence, they simply reinterpret everything you say just to protect their ego. And then, of course, they double down on their original misunderstanding.
Schopenhauer made this really profound observation about how much of ourselves we just throw away. People willfully lock themselves inside their current level of understanding. They actively sacrifice their ability to change, adapt, or grow purely because they want to hold on to that warm, comfortable, ego-driven desire to always be right. Think about the sheer scale of that. The vast majority of a person's potential can literally just be handed over to their ego. The intense desire to be right is, effectively, a signed contract to never learn anything new. Because to learn, you first have to admit you were wrong. But if you're structurally blind to the gap between your own belief and actual reality, you can never admit you're wrong. So absolutely no amount of outside evidence can unlock a door that they have firmly, stubbornly bolted from the inside.
And finally, part 6, the antidote of doubt, turning the mirror inward.
Okay, so how do we actually get out of this trap? Well, time for a hard truth. It's time to take all this intense analysis and point it directly at ourselves. Here's the terrifying part. Everything we've just discussed, the blindness, the fool's paradise, that closed loop, it isn't just about those other people. It's a fundamental human condition. Every single idiot out there deeply believes they are intelligent. And when you are operating in a domain where you lack knowledge, this absolutely applies to you. Both you and I have been the confidently wrong person in the room at some point. It's a bitter pill to swallow, but it's true.
So what's Schopenhauer's ultimate solution to this? It's something called productive doubt. Now, highly intelligent people don't live in paralyzing fear of being wrong, but they do constantly use productive doubt to stress test their own certainty. They actively fight against that cheap, easy dopamine rush of unearned confidence by constantly asking themselves, am I really sure about this? What critical context might I be totally missing here? Who actually knows more than me on this topic? And most importantly, what specific evidence would it actually take to change my mind? Because if you can't answer that last question, my friend, you are trapped inside the closed loop.
So, I'm going to leave you with a bit of a challenge for this week. Pick just one topic that you feel completely unshakably confident about, something you know you are right about. And this week, actively go out and hunt for the strongest arguments and the best evidence that directly contradict your position. And I don't mean looking for weak arguments just so you can smugly dismiss them. Genuinely try to test your own certainty. Because at the end of the day, true wisdom doesn't look like loud, absolute certainty. True wisdom requires the profound, quiet humility to actually embrace doubt. So, are you brave enough to find out what you don't know? Think about it.